Hello, everyone. Welcome to our monthly seminar on spirituality and health. And I am very thrilled to be able to introduce to you Dr. Mark Faries. Dr. Faries is a professor and extension health specialist in behavioral medicine with the Texas A&M Extension Service, part of Family and Community Health, and is adjunct faculty with the Texas A&M School of Medicine and School of Public Health. His research and extension efforts explore why and how people initiate and maintain healthy behaviors, with a focus on theoretical, self-regulatory, and religious aspects of healthy lifestyles, especially through the lens of ancient Christianity. He is the founding director of the Well Church Initiative that supports clergy and faith communities with health education, training, and resources. He is going to speak on the topic of a passionate view of health behavior. And for the faith community, there could be no more important topic than emphasizing exercise, diet, and various forms of health behaviors, given that the one characteristic of faith communities that adversely is affecting health is weight. So that's one area in the church that a lot of work needs to be done in terms of exercise, diet, and again, just living a healthy lifestyle. And no better person to talk about this than Mark Faries. Mark, take it away.
Thank you so much. I'm going to hopefully, if you can please confirm that looks okay to you.
Looks good.
Yeah, no, actually, in the weight loss world is where I got started with my field. If you're not familiar, behavioral medicine, we look at one, how behavior either increases or decreases risk of disease, disability, or premature death. Um, which is also great when people ask you at social events what you study. But we look at not only behavior, but the physiology, how that behavior does increase the risk, and then the psychology around that behavior. And really, in summary, what I want to present today is that change is hard. It's difficult for many, many people, and perhaps you can relate to that. Lord knows that I can too. In our world of chronic disease, for example, we know that 80% of all chronic disease, our most common and costly of all diseases in the US, is preventable with these four key lifestyle factors. A healthy diet is the leading risk factor for premature death in the US. It has now surpassed, for a while now, surpassed smoking as that leading risk factor, and it counts for 1 out of 5 deaths globally. And in one of those studies that established these four factors in their strength of prevention, it was called the Potsdam study in Germany, a very large study, very prominent study, um, also found that only 9% of the people surveyed maintained all four of those lifestyle factors. In the US, this has also been looked at, and it sits around 5% in the last study that was looked at that can maintain all five of these. And as Dr. Cohen mentioned, there's other data we have, right? These issues that pop up. So, for example, for the data geeks out there, 80% of people, there's data to support that they don't get enough physical activity just for general health and function. 90% not getting enough, eating enough vegetables. 2% of high school students, if you're interested in that group, only 2% meet the vegetable recommendations just for general health. And then fairly shocking, I think, for adolescents, only 1 out of every 2 adolescents don't even eat a single serving of a vegetable per day. And some of these surveys, I believe, still include like French fries and ketchup as vegetables. So we have, again, a big challenge, but it's recognizing, again, not out of judgment, but just recognizing that the health behavior change can be hard. And so I became fascinated more specifically with the question uh, early on in my career is why is change so hard? Why is it difficult? And so I dove headfirst into health behavior change theory in my doctoral training, I sort of leaned toward certain theories like of self-regulation, monitoring, and changing our behavior, ideally to stay in line with some goal. And then hopefully through self-help, right? Like finding the right motivation, training the right abilities, maybe joining the right program, but particularly reaping enough of this elusive key ingredient, self-control, so that we can override an unhealthy response to make a healthful response possible. And so I looked at try to develop some new theories with what are called medical triggers. So when a patient gets a diagnosis of some sort, why do some people change? Why do some people not? What is the emotional, motivational, and behavioral responses to such things? Then we started translating theory into practice, particularly in the world of lifestyle medicine, why we don't just do it, the intention behavior gap, looking at medication adherence when lifestyle is the medicine, trying to frame some things for application. We wrote book chapters, edited books, bringing in experts across the world to discuss this question of behavior. Yet, well, and I love this stuff. I still teach this stuff as well, undergraduate, graduate, to providers, practitioners, and so on. However, the struggle still remains, as does this question, why is change so hard? So, in lieu of time for today, I'll kind of spare you the backstory, but I now have a new perspective on health behavior and its struggle, what I call a passionate view of health behavior, hence the name of this presentation. There is one minor, maybe major caveat that this perspective or paradigm is neither mine nor new. In fact, it's quite ancient and from some wisdom that has come before us, particularly in the Christian faith, that's rich with instruction, principles on our health and wellness. And I find an explanation for why change can be so difficult and how we can overcome the struggle to adopt a healthy lifestyle. And during that time of looking at behavior change, kind of one light bulb moment for me within that backstory is that I was recognizing in my research a almost an innate power that people had that they were fighting against when they were trying to change. Some would describe it as like desire or cravings or, I want to do the right thing. I'm fighting something. And yes, there were environments, but I'm talking about something that was more internal. And most of my theoretical perspective deals with the individual and how they interact with the world around them. And so I would use, when I was teaching this sort of thing, this quote here, as you see, from St. Paul of Tarsus, was a Pharisee and had written this letter to the early Christian church in Rome, an epistle. And as you see, it says, I don't understand my own actions. I don't do what I want, but I do the very thing I hate. I have the desire to do what is right, but not the ability to carry it out. I don't do evil I do not want, is what I keep on doing. Now, he's talking about this pursuit of holiness. But I couldn't help but shake, right? Especially that middle part with self-regulation. This is exactly what I was finding, not only within myself, but with others in the pursuit of healthiness, so to speak. And he was also talking about this inner power that he was fighting against, particularly before baptism. And he was struggling with this inner power that seems so similar. And I started thinking, well, maybe there are similarities here. I just couldn't shake this idea that maybe this inner power that he was talking about was also the inner power we were fighting against in the pursuit of healthiness. And so with this hint, I started thinking, well, how does he describe that inner struggle? And then what solution does he share and how can that maybe teach us something? And so I started going back further and further back to that wisdom. So I looked at the tradition, teaching, and faith that the disciples of the apostles, so are called, if you're not familiar, are called the apostolic fathers, who followed the apostles, and then those who followed them, also called the church fathers, church mothers sometimes, or the monastic community, who had dedicated and sacrificed their lives to preserve this faith, teaching, and tradition that Jesus Christ had given and that the apostles preached. And in summary, what I ended up finding was that it's not just a struggle, with this inner power for control, this war for control is what they would say. It's not just a struggle, it is a war. And so what I'd like to do for ease of application today is take a little bit of a dive into this. And I'm going to organize it into four layers, so to speak, or levels of the war: war of body, war of flesh, war of soul, and war of spirit. I will note that this is sharing what I'm continually learning, and I seem like I learn every day. And there's probably nothing else I've done that's really taught me that the more you learn, the less you know, as particularly this project has been. And so this is an outline. It's a prelude, not a finale. And of course, I have no authority, so it's direction, not dogma by any means. And I'm excited to share, hopefully be edifying for you, and please forgive my ignorance. So first is level is the war of body. It is very clear from this perspective that the Christian is not at war against the body. They're rather it's allies with the body, warring against anything that aims to destroy it. Thus, to view the body as God views it sets the standard for all behavior, including for what's done with the body and to the body. And so, as you see from this quote from Dr. Stanley Harakas, any sort of deliberate harm to one's own health and their body all constitute inappropriate behavior for the Christian. There's many reasons for this. I'm going to highlight a few. Many of these, again, you may be familiar. The first is that with the whole person, the body's made in the image of God, image being the potentiality in God and the likeness being represented, more of the realization of that potentiality in body and behavior to be like Christ, the perfect image of God. And so with this, there's particular quotes or comments around the uniqueness of how man was made, humanity was made. St. Basil the Great, for example, has a quote, and I'll read it here. Ponder how you were molded. Consider the workshop of nature. The hand that received you is God's. May what is molded by God not be defiled by evil, not be altered by sin. May you not fall from the hand of God. You are a vessel divinely molded, having come into being from God. Glorify your Creator. So this kind of wonder and joy of being uniquely molded and informed by the very hands of God, unlike the rest of creation, as much as I like the far side, it was man that was created by the hands of God. And then the fact remains that in this ancient kind of original authentic Christianity view, that by its very nature, the one religion that values the body most of all. And again, this is seen in the doctrine of creation, whereby the body too is deemed to be made in the image of God. This is a quote from Dr. Jean-Claude Larcher. And if you haven't read his book, The Theology of the Body, he has a lot of great works, Theology of Illness as well. But particularly the theology of the body is I think, a great ideal summary of this ancient Christian view of the body. So I highly recommend that. And you'll see if you look at that the other big thing is that the body is seen as an integral part of the whole person. And so, again, another quote from that text, that just to harm the body is to harm the whole person. And even so, to tend to and heal the body is to take care of the whole person. They're integrated. And more specifically, the body is to be an instrument animated by the soul. And we'll see this in a bit. And it gets a little confusing, at least from like me growing up. I didn't really understand or know kind of these views of the body itself. We tend to think of just like the fleshly body, the physical meat, and that is an aspect. But a lot of times when they're talking about body, I've learned that it's more of a collection and expression of ability. So you can have a physical body, you can have a spiritual body, and so on. How can that be? Well, you're looking at the powers. They talk about the senses that can be used or abused. They can be strengthened, weakened, or wielded and neglected, and so on. And so when you think body, think about the abilities and powers that are collected as more like a nexus of those potentialities. Also, you may be very familiar with the idea that the body is seen as God's temple. We hear this a lot in the work that we do across the state with our research and our extension work, and that's why people are making changes to their health. Now, they may define and clarify different behaviors, as we'll see, of what connects to the body as the temple. But the idea fairly generally is that it's holy, set apart, and not to be destroyed. Uniquely, this word for destroy, often you'll see that in English translations, or something like corrupting, maybe ruining, tends to be a common translation as well. But the idea is that you're taking something that has been set apart as holy and you're moving it down from its higher sacred level, corruption, ruining, damage, neglecting, and so on. And that's a very important view of the body from this ancient view. Also, extremely important, as we'll see a little bit later again, is that the body being a temple has been cleansed. So by Christ, the divine and human nature coming together, but not confused in this healing of human nature, this cleansing of human nature by Christ, that harkens back to the Day of Atonement in the Old Testament and using the blood or life to cleanse the inside of the Holy of Holies, the stuff there for the coming presence of the Holy Spirit. And so they connect to that, that the body being the temple of God, being cleansed by Christ, again, bringing this human divine nature together, again, not as one unique nature, but unconfused, was able to cleanse that for the coming presence of the Holy Spirit with Pentecost. And so those two things are overlapped quite a bit. I'd mentioned that, again, different people connect different behaviors, at least is what we found. This is one of our early studies, looking at what behaviors people believe destroy God's temple. And in this smaller sample, the first study, and we've seen this replicated, we do see that it, of course, varies by individual, but also by Christian denomination. And traditionally, the hypothesis was that certain behaviors like excessive drinking of alcohol, drug use, smoking tobacco, and so on would be seen as behaviors destroying God's temple. And we found a higher percentage of people. But things like unhealthy eating, poor diet, inactive sedentary lifestyles, Dr. Koenig, there's obesity, much lower percentage of people believe that those behaviors, even though they were also health-related behaviors, were able and willing to destroy the body, God's temple before its time. And so we've been looking at that a bit more. The reason is, again, because so many people find this importance of the body being God's temple. A little bit we get, but sort of the final big aspect of the body that I want to bring up is that the human body, our body, is a member, the Christian's body is a member of Christ's body. And this isn't a member like of an organization, but they're very clear. It's like, no, you are actually Christ's body. And so St. Paul can talk about, if you take your body, a member of Christ's body, and exchange that with a harlot, with a prostitute, then you're not doing that with your body, you're doing that with Christ's body. And so this quote here from St. John Chrysostom in the 4th century, speaking to that, for the Christian, whatever is done with or against the body is done against Christ's body, for it is not your body which is insulted, since it is not your body at all, but Christ's. And so that's a very, very important perspective of how we not only treat our body, but also others. And this would be something behind the motivation of having the body as an instrument, and that you see here being something that's functioning, a functioning member, so to speak. St. Maximus the Confessor, quote here, says, if you keep your body free from disease and sensual pleasure, it will help you serve what is more noble. The idea is that health alone is not the end goal. Health is a means, is a way of helping people in their ministry, in their pursuit of holiness, so to speak. There's tons more that's listed, that's discussed about the importance of the body. We don't have time to dive in that now, but I want to provide a summary with this quote from St. John Cassian in the 4th, 5th century. He writes that bodily illness is not an obstacle to purity of heart, because clearly we all can struggle with that, provided that we give the body what its illness requires, not what gratifies our desire for pleasure. Food, in this example, is to be taken insofar as it supports our life, not to the extent of enslaving us to these impulses of desire. So to eat moderately and reasonably is to keep the body in health, not deprive it of holiness. And so for me, this was big because remember, when I was reading St. Paul and that sort of pursuit of holiness, pursuit of healthiness, and like, is there some relationship? We find that yes, there is. The goal is this pursuit of holiness, and that there's things that we can do, particularly live an unhealthy lifestyle, not in and of itself, but particularly as you see underlined here, this pursuing a desire for pleasure, getting enslaved, being moved by and enslaved by these impulses. That was really the important focus. And so that led me and leads us into that second layer of the war that I call the war of flesh. Most, while we do hear that the flesh is like the physical flesh of the body, most often it's talked about as this condition, mortal condition or state of human nature, receiving these garments of skin that was brought about by Adam and Eve's trespass. That there was, of course, spiritual death, separation of the soul in some way from God, and then eventually, when you separate from life, eventually physical death, separation of the soul from the body. And St. John of Damascus talks about that. But the mortality, this state of human nature, brings about fear of death and fear of dissolution of the body. And thus that creates a situation where humans are moved by certain what are called passions. It's a passionate or impassioned condition where it becomes to an extent that we'll see irrational, more like creatures of instinct, the brute creation, more animal-like rather than more spiritual, as we will see. And thus, sort of a thesis here is that this passionate and impassioned condition is very important, in my opinion, from a health perspective. And as you see here, I propose is the culprit of the unhealthy temptations and lifestyles in which the Christian struggles. And perhaps everybody struggles, whether they struggle against it or not. And so when we look at the specifics of the passions, hence again, a passionate view of health behavior, pathos or pathos, there's much to be said that humanity was created to be in motion in a single direction, in ascent. As St. Maximus says and St. Gregory of Nazianzus, a beginning in being and then a voluntary state of well-being. And so if you happen to study health and well-being, from this ancient Christian view, well-being is acquiring the likeness of God. That is well-being, first and foremost, and then eventually to rest in eternal well-being in God. So a carnal passion, a carnal being of the flesh, is movement at variance with nature. Also, this quote here, the passions from Dimitri Staniloy, the passions represent the lowest level to which human nature can fall. The man is brought by them to a state of passivity, of slavery. In fact, they overcome the will so that the man of the passions is no longer a man of will. We say rather that he is a man ruled, enslaved, carried along by the passion. So in short, the passions make us passive. So think pathos, passivity, pathology. That would be a suffering where we are not in controlled, again, not unlike a disease or illness that we experience passively. And so the result, the scriptures warn a lot about living according to the flesh, the sort of unnatural, irrational, and as we'll see, sinful, luring us into kinship with the carnal passions that then set the stage for unhealthy lifestyle. There's two layers for those, if you want to dive into this a bit more, that I think are very important to separate out. I think it eases my understanding at least. And one of those layers is appetite, edene or hedone, where we get hedonism, this idea of avoiding pain and pursuing pleasure. Often you may see this called a blameless passion, because again, this mortal state, we get hungry, we get tired. And in and of itself, that may be called a blameless passion, but we are being moved by those appetites because of our state of human nature, the sort of unnatural state that we are in. However, there is discussion that these are still compelling. So we need to keep our eye out specifically. And we in our research, we can measure this in different ways, as you see these questions here, asking people how strong their appetite is at any given time. or throughout the day, how hungry people get, how difficult they find it from eating. Again, more self-control type questions around diet. There's also several theories that more innate type psychology that would say, well, we're just sort of, these are like our innate desires, right? We crave energy, calories, high fat, high sugar foods. Um, we conserve energy, so we kind of want to be lazy, or we store energy and we can store it quite effectively, most commonly in fat storage, triglycerides in the muscle, in the liver, and in the body, and so on. Yet they would say that it's sort of like this, and the reason I have this caveman picture here is because that may be how it's presented in some of the more popular literature. And they would say that we're just simply having a natural response to an unnatural environment, right? You take the caveman or woman and put them in today's environment, then what would you expect, right? We have, and I think like in the 1990s, well, in 2023, there was nearly 125 pounds of added sugar and sweeteners provided per person to consume each year in the US, 125 pounds. In 1909, that was 80 pounds. So a single fast food meal, as we see, can give us tons of calories. And you've seen all these type of images of how portions have changed over time, what we're used to consuming. Some people call it portion distortion. And looking at not only caloric intake, but focusing again on the environment and again, calling it an unnatural environment. But are we really having a natural response? Well, from the ancient Christian view, remember our state of human nature is not natural at all. And so it would maybe more like having an unnatural response to perhaps an unnatural environment. So we create this setup where appetites are competing, fighting for prioritization. So like this perpetual king of the hill, where you're trying to supplant a strong appetite, let's say for unhealthful food, an unpreferred passion for a stronger passion. We need something to arise, fear of disease, feeling more attractive, fitting into the right social group, something more powerful that can rise up and knock down that appetite for unhealthful food. Self-control from this is likely short-lived. And in my experience, few are successful in leveraging this warring flesh for benefit, nor really able to truly thrive and flourish while doing so. The scripture at the bottom, St. James writes that what quarrels and what causes fights among you, is it not this, that your appetites are at war within you? Again, he paints a picture of chaos and disorder, this picture of war. St. Mark the monk says sometimes a person reduces one passion by living another even more luxuriously, and then praised by those unaware of his intentions. Perhaps even he himself is unaware of what he is doing as he toils without hope of profit. This fighting and fighting. And I found over the years that many people feel like that, right? That I'm just have these passions that are competing against each other. And this one wins out sometimes, this one wins out sometimes, again, without that type of control. And this is where it gets troublesome more so, is that appetites can be controlling. Self-control is proposed as the solution to these competing appetites, right? But as St. John Chrysostom says, stubborn as appetite is in the tyranny of the belly. By the way, the belly is often referred to as the seat of the passions. Nevertheless, I bridle it and give not myself up to the passion, but endure all labor not to be drawn aside by it. And so we can have self-control proposed as a solution. However, these passions, particularly these appetites, are volatile and lead to the second layer called desire. This is a different word. And so if you're reading this in the Greek, remember appetites were edene, and this word for desire is epithemia, and it's an inordinate, excessive desire, focused passion. Whereas appetites were like the blameless passions, these would be more of the blameworthy passions or sinful passions. And each person is tempted, as St. James also says, when he is lured and enticed by his own desires. Again, from this word epithemia, The desire, when it is conceived, gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. And so desire is connected with sinful passion, with sin. And times they will just equate this type of passion. And most times when they talk about passion, they're talking about this. They'll just equate it with sin. Now, in this ancient view, sin is simply not just a set of rules. Sin is a power, a monstrous power, crouching, like some kind of monster, like a disease or a poison that dwells in the flesh, able to subdue and make one passive by means of bodily senses. So it's something that's dwelling. And so you'll see a lot about needing to be healed from that, cleansed from that. It's metastasizing, you're feeding it, things like that. The wording really talks about this power. And so you may already start to see that, oh, okay, well, maybe that's that inner power that they're talking about, not just appetites, but maybe there's more to the story of appetites because I am mortal. Maybe there's something else, something more powerful at play. And so when we feed that, what they'll talk about, and in my summary, I like to bring up three things just to keep it simple. And what you'll see is one, the desire will bring us and move us as passions move us. Remember, passivity beyond need. This wisdom from Proverbs, feed me with the food that is needful for me, lest I be full and deny you and say, who is the Lord? So there are spiritual implications to this, as we will see. Also, it can move us beyond control. So as a thought experiment, consider maybe an unhealthy food or maybe drink that you enjoy, you choose to enjoy on a regular basis, but you know you should cut back. All right, so think about a food or a drink you enjoy, but you know you should cut back on. So I would ask, could you give that up forever? Just stop now and never have it again. And you say, I'm doing it out of choice. So yes, I could give it up forever because it's my choice. But if there's anything you're thinking about that you thought you were doing it by choice, but then when I ask, could you get it up forever? Or could you at least limit it to a healthful moderation? Could you fast from it for 40 days? Could you do this or that? And if you have any issues with that, like, I don't know if I could do that, like I do, then it's not necessarily choice that's driving that lack of control. And so what I like to talk about is that deceptively, lack of control of unhealthful desires, I think often disguises itself as choice or liberty. And it wears, like I use this analogy of that plastic facade, black rimmed glasses, a nose, and a mustache. And it sort of eases through the crowd unrecognized for what it truly is. And then third, these desires move us beyond health. St. Mark the monk again, he who enjoys bodily pleasures beyond the proper limit will pay for the excess 100-fold in sufferings. If we feed desires, this ancient view would say the next clear and final step under the war of flesh is to move to works of the flesh. And you may be familiar with these, or living according to the flesh, as I mentioned earlier. Going back to that St. James quote, again, what causes quarrels and what causes fights among you? So he talks about the appetites first, right? And then he brings up the desire, and then that leads to murder, further quarreling, fighting, to actual works. What I would discover is that if you look at the works of the flesh, as I showed you before, the verses, St. Paul says, and things like these. Well, in this ancient view, many have taken that as an opportunity to talk about gluttony in particular. And that's the work I'm doing now, so I'm not going to put it here. But looking into gluttony specifically, some people call it gastromargia, gastrimargia in Greek, this idea of gut madness. And this quote from St. John Chrysostom, you have received a belly that you may feed, not distend it, that you may have mastery over it. Again, we're seeing self-control here, right? Not have it as a mistress over you, that it may minister to you for the nourishment of the other parts, not that you may minister to it, not that you may exceed limits. And so if gluttony, overeating beyond control, beyond health, beyond need, is a desire and work of the flesh, then maybe we should consider from this view, what does the ancient Christian view say is the solution? Because we know that it's common. This is a Pew Research Center data study and found that this was mostly Protestant Christians in this study, some Catholics as well, that 60% self-reported that they had, in their subjective mind, overeaten in the past week. Maybe it was more, maybe it was less, but again, the majority. And so, from this ancient Christian view, the idea of warring and trying to find some way for the flesh to beat the flesh is not going to work because these are symptoms of a deeper illness. Then we need something more. The flesh is broken and we cannot fix a broken thing with itself. And so, through this lens of a passionate view of health behavior, I'd like to say that succumbing to the control of these carnal passions, desire, and works is more of a sign of bondage in need of manumission, from what I'm picking up. It's of corruption in need of cleansing, of weakness in need of strength, of ailment in need of nourishment, and then sickness in need of healing. And so we move to the third part of the war here, as we start kind of landing the plane for our time. But the war of soul, we see very clearly here that to abstain from fleshly desires. Why? Because they wage war against the soul. And so the soul was, if we go back to creation, so psyche, some people say. So at creation, the body was molded, as we saw, and fashioned by God. And then if you read, what was added was the breath or spirit of God, pneuma, becoming a, quote, living soul. And so it talks about animals being living souls as well. But this quote from St. John of Damascus, as you see in the black, is a summary of what this ancient Christian view of the soul might be. As you see, it's complex. You can't just say it's, it's beautiful. It's complex. It's beyond reduction to some quote unquote thing that's confined into the body, or that kind of Platonic Gnostic view that the body is some kind of prison house of the soul or so on. That's not this ancient Christian view. Yet in union with the body, there are certain aspects of the soul that I think are vitally important to help us understand the pursuit of healthiness, at least. A lot more could be said. First, to harken back to what we've already said, that the body is an instrument of the soul. And I love this quote here from St. Cyril of Jerusalem in the 300s, 4th century. Do not tell me that the body is the cause of sin, for if the body is the cause of sin, then why does a dead body not sin? Put a sword in the right hand of one just dead, and no murder takes place. Excuse me, let beauties of every kind pass before a youth just dead, and no impure desires arise. Why? Because the body sins not of itself, but through the body. The body is an instrument. And so the soul, the life, holds the body together, puts it into action, interacts with the physical and spiritual realities as we see. And particularly, I want to highlight three key powers that the soul has that I think, again, are related to this pursuit of healthiness: sensational, rational, and intellectual. The first is sensational, the vital power. You may see that, even maybe in Greek philosophy, this idea of my body grows, right? Plants grow. There's something about the soul, the life, that just helps that happen. Nourishment. It's sort of hidden growth, formation, function, development, and our lifestyle choices can either diminish or enhance that. But particularly, there's this active power of sensation and perception, or sense perception. So this is the idea of using our five senses to apprehend and discern the material physical world around us. And so we're clearly thought to share this with animals. Again, as I mentioned earlier, we're also created by God as living souls in Genesis 1. And so this warning, though, of sensual pleasure, and you may see that pop up particularly in the scripture, is routinely warned against more as an illness of the soul and a mother of vice. And so you'll see things about guarding the soul, and that the senses are sort of like windows or gates to the soul. They need to be monitored, guarded, and shut if needed to protect from being lured away into those desires that we have mentioned and eventually works. St. Gregory of Nyssa gives this wonderful analogy that carnal desire is like a snake with scales of bodily senses, and that sneaking into the soul from the back, and that one has to block up as far as possible through these chinks presented by the life of the body, because once that snake gets in, because of its scales, it only goes one direction. So it's difficult to dislodge from the precincts of the mind because of those scales. So once you let it in, it's really hard to get it out. So they talk about, St. Paisios talks about plucking weeds when they're young, not when they've grown. So being attentive and watchful. Then if you don't, then it moves into like incensive powers, or themos, most commonly translated as anger, but it's more like spiritedness. Perhaps some people translate it as courage. This desiring power, this power of the soul to move one from appetite to desire and then to works. That's called the desiring power, again, related to epithemia, where these desires are aroused and stirred into action, and it moves us to an active agent. Again, we're a passive recipient with passivity. They'll talk about the bodily senses being like horses, madly racing, and the soul is like the charioteer that's trying to hold the reins of all of these senses and appetites and desires. And that brings us to the second level of the power of the soul being rational. Again, passionate, a passion, as we saw earlier, is irrational activity of the soul. However, it's important to note that logikos, in this ancient view, yes, it's a thinking soul endowed with the power of reason, or logos, but it's not just reason defined by anyone, because anybody can say, oh, that's the rational view, that's reason. No, this ancient Christian view is pretty clear, I think, that logos in us, our logos, our reason, is meant to resemble the logos, capital L logos, the word Christ. And so, because the passions are not included in the image of God, reason is to be the master over the passions. As you see from St. Basil, O human, you are a ruling being, and why do you serve the passions as a slave? St. Macrina, the elder sister actually of St. Basil and St. Gregory of Nyssa, who's absolutely wonderful, she warns that instinct of desire um, is something to be, again, using reason to control. She said, but if reason drops the reins, then it's dragged behind like a charioteer who's gotten entangled in his car. And so this is, again, I found a fitting description for many people who are trying to overcome an unhealthy lifestyle. This is what it feels like they're being dragged by their desires for food or laziness or other passions, whatever those lusts, cravings that they might be. This idea of power of control has been lost, and now reason's no longer in the driver's seat. And so a man without self-control, as the wisdom of Proverbs teaches, is like a city broken into and left without walls. Because of our challenging environment, there are many things I think that we do as humans to break down our own walls. And so this is, if you go back and if you're interested in health behavior, this is where I think, teaching temperance and moderation and prudence and all that is very, very helpful virtue. Because virtue is seen from St. Augustine here of Hippo. Virtue helps bridle the lust of the flesh and prevents them from securing the consent of the mind and then dragging it into every kind of wickedness. Or if you've maybe seen or heard about making no provision from the flesh, Romans 13:14. So another question I like to ask people is, how easy is it for you to eat unhealthfully in your house? And so somebody may say over the years, well, it's pretty easy to eat unhealthfully in my house. And so I was like, well, you're just making control harder, right? Self-control harder on yourself. There are some things that my wife can keep out, for example, and I'm like, yeah, it doesn't matter. Other things, if she keeps out, it's just way too hard, and vice versa for her. So, however, that even though we may bring that up in general conversation, this idea of passion, of desire, being enslaved, puts a little bit of a different picture on that, I think, and an urgency to that, and really thinking about, am I making provision for the flesh? Because we may have the desire to do what is right, but not the ability to carry it out. And so I might challenge us to think, we've gone through all this and we're pushing our time here to end in the next few minutes, but are we back at square one? Didn't I start with this? Like I have the desire. So now it just emphasizes the problem more, I think, in connecting the passions and the flesh and living according to the flesh, desire, works of the flesh, um, as a part of this struggle, this war to adopt a healthy lifestyle. It emphasizes it more, but we're not back at square one, actually. I think we are beyond that, and now we have a foundation to sort of land the plane, as we'll see here in just a moment, to the war of spirit. Before I do that, though, I want to highlight real quickly, um, there's a third power of the soul that I guess me growing up, I didn't ever hear about this. And it's sometimes called an intellectual power. But the idea is that there's this animal world, the brute creation was created sensible with senses, as we've already mentioned. And then there's the intelligible, the noetos, the noetic world, the angelic world, the spiritual world. And then humans are talked about as being created both intelligible and sensible, a mingled worshiper, as I've heard us called. And that St. Basil expresses that man has been given this intellectual soul through which to comprehend God and then to pluck, he says, quote, pluck the sweetest fruit of wisdom. And so we have our five senses, but there is this noetic sense that is also talked about a lot. The nous, N-O-U-S in Greece, in Greek, the mind, sometimes again from Latin, I think it's translated more like intellect, but this is not like academic intellect, book study intellect. Um, it's talked about, as you see in Black, like a seed of wisdom, a spiritual center. Some people just call it the spirit, our spirit, not the Holy Spirit. The purest part of the soul, the mind of the soul, the eye of the heart, the eye of the soul. And that eye is important because just like I'm looking now, I look out my window and all of this information's coming in. I'm sensing that through my eyes. The nous is like that, but to the spiritual realm, so to speak, which perceives the perfection of the godly life. We are to have that mind, that nous of Christ, 1 Corinthians 2:16. So when it says mind, often it's talking about the nous or the thoughts related to that, dionia. But that noetic world becomes very important, as we'll see, when we want to have one, a healthy soul, and then two, be able to image the Christ God that we are made. And so if a healthy soul is the life that takes pleasure in and ascends to well-being, again, with the body toward the likeness of God and virtue, then I like to say that the sick soul, in summary, is that life that takes pleasure in and descends with the body toward likeness of the flesh in vice. And we can start seeing these things come together that now finally allow us to start to dive into this last layer. We're not going to be able to dive into that. So I'm going to highlight a couple things. First and foremost, the ancient Christian view is that this war is really a spiritual war. We do not wage war according to the flesh. We already said that that's not going to be very fruitful anyway. And even our weapons shouldn't be of the world, of the flesh. As St. Paul says here to a letter he had written to the Corinthians, the church in Corinth. And so the spirit, pneuma, again, as we saw, was received with God's breath. It animates, gives ability to, knows the depths and thoughts, experiences of the soul, to be kept holy and blameless with the body and soul, from the stain, from that infection of fleshly desire and works. Particularly, it highlights, number two, that it's a very, very clear black and white dichotomy, that the desires of the flesh are against the desires of the spirit. There's no gray area, there's no lukewarm. They are completely opposed to each other. And that opposition is what keeps us from doing the things that we want to do. And so a way for me to depict this, just to kind of help in my mind, St. Maximus tells us that the soul lies between God and matter, okay? And then our potentialities, remember we talked about that with the body, how we define the body, our abilities, our powers, potentialities. can be united to one or the other. And so there's a quote from Father Maximus Constus, who is brilliant talking about the passions. And I love this quote from a presentation of his. He says, "The fleshly passions lure our energy from the spiritual reality to the sensual reality, and our attention from the depths of things to the surface of things, more interested in pleasure than truth." He also says that every depth has a surface, but not every surface has a depth. And so understanding that the dichotomy of the spiritual and of the spirit and the flesh and the soul between, this is a really, I think, good summary of the situation and the war of spirit and how we're supposed to respond to that as Christians. And so the way to go through a couple final things to summarize here. The living in the according to the flesh is described not only in Scripture but afterwards as futility, and not the way learned from Christ, as you see here, but rather to live in freedom. So we had mentioned about Christ incarnation, but also moving forward through his baptism, his death on the cross, the harrowing of Hades, his resurrection, ascension. All of that encompasses this idea of freedom, that we've been freed from powers, that we've been freed. Whoops, sorry about that. We've been freed from, not freed to do whatever we want, freed for the flesh, but freed from the flesh. And that's really, really important because, as St. Paul talked about in Romans, to go back to that sin, to go back to that monstrous power, is to re-enslave ourselves that we've been freed from this ancient Christian view. But with this freedom, we can then be filled, as you see here, with the Spirit. So the way I like to summarize it, this transition from freedom to filling, is that without the Spirit, behavior will be imperfect and incomplete and out of control. And this Spirit, again, is the Holy Spirit, capital S Spirit. And then the body and the soul, they're left on their own, right? To sort of war away from the things, the flesh, the desires, the works that the Christian has been freed from through baptism. With the Spirit, then we're dealing with something that when we're in communion, we're being filled, we're working out our salvation with fear and trembling and so on. That is in control. We can live with freedom and power from the impassioned flesh, and particularly to quote unquote walk in a manner worthy of the Lord, fully pleasing to him. So we can move from this filling to footsteps. And some of this you may have seen, this scripture about those who live according to the flesh set their minds on things of the flesh. They walk according to the flesh, as we saw earlier. But again, in contrast, those who live according to the Spirit set their minds on things of the Spirit. So this walk then moves us to what St. Paul says, if you do that, if you walk by the Spirit, you will not gratify the desires of the flesh. This is very important for me because remember, it started out as that was our struggle, gratifying the desires of the flesh. And the solution given here is by walking in the Spirit. St. John Chrysostom comments on this verse. He says, having spoken of the cause of the disease, he, Paul, likewise mentions the remedy which confers health, not only physical health, soul health, spiritual health, whole person health. Now, if you see walking in the Spirit is like the prescription, I like to think about, well, what does that even mean, right? It's like getting a pill bottle and it says, take this. Well, how much? And so you flip it over and there's like the take as directed, tells you to do this or that. We don't have time to get in that, but I would like to recommend looking at 2 Peter 1, 3 through 10 as sort of a starting point, and actually digging into those words that are used, as you see here. He says, make every effort, like speedy diligence, to supplement your faithfulness with virtue, your virtue with knowledge, and so on. If you've seen that before, that's a really good, I think, starting point. But any study into the solution of what does walking in the Spirit mean from this ancient Christian view is key, because it's walking in the Spirit that produces the fruit, the self-control being one of those fruit. Ingratia, dominion within. Some people call it continence or translated as continence. But I want to highlight that this is not a self-help solution. It's more like spirit help, the helper, um, the fruit of the Spirit, not of us alone. Yet we are also called to walk in the Spirit, right? So you'll see this ancient Christian view talking a lot about co-working with God, cooperating with God, synergia or synergia, synergy, because it's that participation with God that transforms us. Just like my participation in the flesh transforms me that way, my participation cooperating with God and the grace, the activities that are going on in the world, I participate in that, and thus I'm transformed. And so St. Basil the Great, two more slides here. St. Basil the Great says that this strong fleshly desire is a disease of the soul. And so that again changes the way we view about this struggle, this war. But health is of the soul is continence, is this ingratia. It's not just self-control, it's dominion within. So not to be drunken is continency. Not to overeat oneself is continency. Continency, as we've seen, makes one free, being at once a medicine and a power, for it does not teach temperance, it gives it. For continency is a grace of God, participating in the activity and the work of God in the world. And finally, then, what would be said is that from this fruit, we continue through faithfulness and true healing and well-being. If I had to summarize, it comes only with the union of body, soul, and Holy Spirit, not as a perfection of man, but of God in man. Okay, I will stop there. Dr. Koenig, thank you everybody for um, coming and listening, and especially during your lunchtime.
Thank you, Mark. Boy, what a presentation. Thank you so much. So many
You are welcome.
insights. Yeah, so many insights I'm sure many have learned from. We have about 3 minutes for questions. So if anyone wants to ask a question to Mark, take advantage of his expertise. Please just unmute yourself and ask your question.
I do see a few questions in here, Dr. Koenig. I can maybe respond to a few, if that's okay.
Sure, in the chat. Yeah.
Yes. David talked about lust being a better translation for the Greek word epithemia, than desire. Lust is used. However, I think, in my opinion, lust tends to send us sort of down like a sexual lust route, and desire allows us to keep it a little bit more broad. Um, And as you say, he says here that since desire can have more of a positive meaning in English, I didn't have time to get into it, and as David mentions here, and it's right on, like a desire of love, desire for God, desire for salvation. Christ desired to be with his disciples. Paul desired epithemia to be with those people in the different churches. And so um, the way it's talked about, and I'd recommend St. Maximus the Confessor in his Ambigua, um, is that the idea is that desire is used because it can be transformed. So it can be elevated from this, again, sensual level to the spiritual. And that can be on a bunch of different fronts, not just the sexual, translating that sort of lust to love, for example, or desire to love, or that themos, anger, to joy. There's a lot of talk about transformation. So I don't disagree with you, David, by any means. I think you could use lust if you especially want to try to separate it out. And I think you make a good point of just only seeing desire as negative, epithemia as negative. And most often it is talked about that way. But again, you do make a great point that it can be positive. All right, Joe, thought-provoking based on observation of the early church. One worthy goal in our physical practice is moderation. Yeah, knowing the right length and not going any further. That's very important, particularly within temperance is where I'd recommend, because moderation is usually connected with temperance, at least in my reading. And temperance being like a fruit of the spirit would allow you to see, well, how do we? We may know, yeah, I need to eat less, I need to moderate, but how do we do that? Also in the ancient Christian church, you're given tools, sacraments, mysteries like fasting, of course, the Eucharist, communion, the body and blood of Christ, that they'll talk about a lot as aids, as spiritual aids to those fruit, to moderation. Is it possible to get a copy of the slides? Yes, I'm going to share those with Dr. Koenig after this, that he'll be able to share with you. Jenny, I find that many of my patients, quote unquote, walk by the flesh as a result of trauma they have experienced, and which causes them to self-medicate, if you will. Chaplains can assist by offering trauma-informed spiritual care. Pastors would be helped by understanding this concept more. See the physician Gabor Mate. I don't know if that's how to say the physician's name. Um, yeah, I completely agree. So everybody brings in their experience and history with them, and it shapes. And actually, if you use the language of the ancient church, it's not that they just have they're walking in the flesh as a result of trauma, but enslaved potentially to that. And if that is an illness and enslavement of the soul, then what does that spiritual care look like? I ask my students about mental health, mental being of the mind. And then I ask them, what is the mind? And they'll say, well, it's the brain. I was like, okay, well, if somebody has mental illness, then how do we treat it? And we go through the different brain options, hormones, lobotomies, or whatever else. But then somebody raised their hand like, well, isn't the mind the soul or connected? I was like, yeah. So how would we treat if somebody had mental illness and it was a soul problem? So you bring up chaplains, and there's a relationship between chaplains and pastors and priests with medical care. And Dr. Koenig, you've talked about this for a long time, this beautiful relationship that can exist between those three. Thanks. Almost done. I appreciate all the positive comments, especially those, again, it's relating to some of views that you already have. Thank God for that. Um, and yes, I have, let's see, I'll get the slides to you. You can reach out to me via email. I really appreciate all the thank yous here in this, Dr. Koenig. I think um, that's all the questions from the chat.
Okay, sounds good.
Could I just ask one quick thing?
If it's not
sure,
too
Dan,
difficult,
make it
Stan, if
quick.
it's not too difficult, yeah.
Dan, make it quick.
We are working on a subject of how to teach generosity, and the question is, people say, when do I know what is enough? And of course, the traditional answer of people is just a little bit more. And so we are trying very much to help people understand the power of understanding just what is enough and to live in peace with that.
That's terrific,
Yes.
Dan. Thank you for that. And Mark, thank you so much for a great presentation. And everyone, thank you for attending. And all of the slides and the video will be on our website like it usually is by this afternoon. So all you have to do is go to our website and you can download the slides. So everyone, see you next month.
Thank you.